Spaghetti worms are a group of marine worms that belong to the polychaetes, which means worms with many bristles. And the spaghetti worms are called spaghetti worms because they have very long tentacles. So you can actually find them everywhere in the marine realm, and even if you go scuba diving or snorkeling, you can see spaghetti worms, but most of the time you just see the tentacles, and it kind of looks like spaghettis that are in a drain, because the polychaete is actually in its tube, and you usually just see the spaghettis or the tentacles. So they live in sediment tubes that they build, and they use the tentacles, which are very long and thin, to ingest the sediment or to capture the sediment with organic matter on it, and they ingest that. And I study the spaghetti worms because they have a very interesting morphology and ecology. So they just look like little aliens, and they are important for the ecosystem because they basically convert small, tiny particles of nutrients and to grow. And when they are bigger, they become actually food themselves for bigger species like fish and crabs. So each species of worms, spaghetti worms, have a certain job or a certain function in the ecosystem. And if I would have to think of one specific important thing about the spaghetti worms, is that they occur in very high abundances. So the biomass is very high, and they are a very important part of the food web. So they convert very small particles of nutrients into biomass. So they grow up to like about 5 inches, the shallow water ones. And they're an important food source for example, fish and crabs. So if you go to a seafood restaurant and you have a flounder on your table, a lot of the biomass that actually makes up the flounder was built up because they ate a lot of polychaete worms and spaghetti worms specifically. This is a very difficult question to answer because we don't know a lot about the different species yet, how they interact with other species and how they shape the environment. But one issue would be if you would extinct those species, a lot of the biomass that they contribute to the environment would be gone. They also shape the environment by constructing the tubes. And the tubes themselves are also a habitat for smaller species that live in those tubes. And they interact with a lot of other species that we haven't even discovered yet. So if you would take out a certain species, we don't even know yet exactly what would happen to the environment. So each species, the biologists call it a niche. That means how the species interact with other species and how they shape the environment and what kind of function they have in the ecosystem. So it would be comparable to take out a certain group of people in our society. Let's say you take out all the plumbers, and you don't really know how would the world work without plumbers. And then you take out engineers, and you don't know it might still work, but maybe not as good. And that's the same when you take out a certain species or even several species. So we don't really know exactly what it would mean to the environment. First of all, people who describe species are, of course, excited to discover new species. And one of the dreams of those people they call taxonomists is to get a list of all the species that exist in all the oceans. And there was a big project called Census Marine Life that lasted for about a decade. And the goal of this project was to actually find all the species and categorize all the species that have been described so far. And it's a large task, and it will go on for probably centuries because there's so many undescribed species out there. Estimations are that we have only described 10% of the species so far. So there's a lot more of species to describe. And only if we have a comprehensive list of species for a certain area, we actually can ask follow-up questions, questions about their ecology, or questions about why they are in the deep ocean or in the shallow ocean. Other species are in the deep water and the shallow water, and we can start asking more meaningful questions if we know what kind of species are out there and where they live. And right now we just have a very incomplete picture of what species are out there and where they live and what kind of function they have for the ecosystem. So you can see that these are all tentacles. It has a lot of tentacles, very long tentacles, and it uses them to ingest, ingest sediment. They collect sediment with those tentacles, and they ingest the sediment. And to the sand they ingest, there's a lot of organic material that sticks to it, and the guts basically filter out the organic material, and the sand basically comes out of them clean, if you want. And that's a good cartoon of a terebellid polychaete or a spaghetti worm. They usually live in the sediment like this, and so the sediment border would be here, and all the tentacles would be on top of the sediment, and the specimen itself is actually in the sediment, so you don't usually see the worm unless you collect it. And there's a nice picture how it looks like when you actually snorkel or scuba dive and you come across a spaghetti worm. So here's the tube, and the worm is like inside the sediment, and you see a lot of those tentacles. So that's what I tried to describe earlier when I said it looks like spaghettis that kind of fell out in the drain when you boil spaghettis or so. So that's how it looks like when you actually come across one. And finally, I just put the drawings of the two species that I have described into the presentation. So this is one of the species. These are the gills, 3 pairs of gills, and here are the long tentacles. And that's the second species. This one has no gills, or they are actually rudimentary, and I cut off in the drawing the tentacles, but they were very long, so just to make it a little easier to draw.